Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in human history when the stories we tell reveal more about us than about the people we claim to be studying. The idea of a mystery love surrounding a public figure is not just a tabloid curiosity or a whisper passed between gossip channels. It is a window into the collective psyche, a subtle indicator of the needs, hopes, and emotional projections of an entire society. When people latch onto the question of whether an innovator, a disruptor, or a restless mind carries a hidden love somewhere in the uncharted corners of their life, it is rarely about the person in question. Instead, it becomes a mirror, reflecting what we fear and what we crave, what we understand about ambition, and what we misunderstand about the price it demands. Some of the greatest scientific insights we've gathered on the neuroscience of attachment, desire, and perception show that even rumors can reveal deep truths about how humans interpret genius. We fill in emotional gaps with stories, because story is how the brain resolves uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one thing the brain hates more than anything else in the world. In my field, we often talk about the cognitive bias known as narrative completion. When the mind encounters an incomplete picture, it instinctively rushes to complete it. Even a silhouette becomes a full figure if we stare at it long enough. And in the case of a visionary who occupies the global conversation almost daily, people assume an emotional arc must exist behind the scenes, some secret love that explains the resilience, the failures, the revelations, the late-night tweets, the unexpected decisions, the seemingly unshakable momentum. We look at intense ambition and wonder, what keeps this person human? Who anchors them? Who softens the edges of a world built on equations, rockets, algorithms, and deadlines? That longing to connect the extraordinary to the ordinary reveals far more about our own neurological architecture than it does about any individual life. But when we analyze this phenomenon through the lens of neuroscience, something fascinating begins to emerge. The story of the mystery love is almost always the same. It is not a literal person. It becomes a symbol for the emotional equilibrium we project onto someone who appears superhuman. It becomes the embodiment of warmth, grounding, and emotional stabilization. And no matter how much someone pushes the boundaries of physics or technology, the public brain, because yes, crowds have a kind of brain of their own, insists on imagining a counterbalance. It is a subconscious attempt to humanize what seems unreachable. The more intense the public figure's work becomes, the more intense the speculation about their unseen personal world grows. It is as if our collective neural circuitry refuses to believe that a human being can survive such pressure without an emotional pillar somewhere hidden in the shadows. This is where the metaphor becomes illuminating, because in neuroscience, a powerful truth emerges. The brain cannot sustain high-level innovation without emotional regulation. Even the most solitary thinkers rely on internalized symbols of comfort, support, or connection, not necessarily a person, but sometimes an idea, a memory, a promise, or even a fear. These emotional anchors function like neural stabilizers. They guide the neurochemical rhythms that allow the mind to navigate chaos without collapsing. When people imagine a mystery love around a visionary, they are, unknowingly, pointing toward a real psychological phenomenon. The brain's need for something or someone that keeps the emotional circuits intact during moments of extreme cognitive and creative overload. I've met countless researchers, engineers, astronauts, doctors, inventors, and entrepreneurs through the years, and many of them share a similar pattern. They rarely talk openly about emotional drivers, not because they lack them, but because they protect them fiercely. Their deepest motivators are internalized, not public-facing. And when you ask them what keeps them going through nights when sleep is a distant luxury, through failures that would break the average spirit, through responsibilities that stretch the mind to its limits, they often describe something that sounds deceptively simple, but is incredibly profound. Some speak of a memory of someone who once believed in them. Others mention a promise they made when they were young. Some talk about the comforting voice of a parent they lost, but still hear in moments of crisis. Some describe an imagined companion, not imaginary in the childish sense, but in the psychological sense, a symbol of emotional safety the brain constructs to maintain balance. And this is where the myth of the mystery love takes its most intriguing turn. It is not always about romance. Sometimes it is the embodiment of purpose. For some, the mystery love is the mission itself, a gravitational pull toward a goal that feels alive, something they form an attachment to as deeply as they would to another human. The brain's reward system does not always distinguish between emotional and intellectual devotion. Dopamine, oxytocin, cortisol, these chemicals do not ask whether the bond is with a person or a purpose. They simply respond to intensity. And when a public figure dedicates themselves to a mission that spans decades, nations, or even planets, the public mind interprets that devotion as something that must have roots in the heart as well. That's why, throughout history, people have always invented romantic myths around brilliant minds. Not because those minds are necessarily hiding secrets, but because people cannot imagine living without the emotional architectures they themselves depend on. Visionaries who function at extreme capacities seem alien to the average observer, and so the audience instinctively crafts a narrative that makes them more relatable. The mystery love becomes a character in a story we write to soothe ourselves, to remind us that even those who build rockets or reinvent industries remain tethered to something familiar. But if we move deeper, far deeper, into the neuroscience of attachment, something even more fascinating emerges. Humans are wired to interpret intensity as evidence of passion. We assume passion must be fueled by romance, companionship, or emotional turbulence. And yet, intense focus often emerges from internal reorganizations of the brain that have nothing to do with external relationships. In the frontal cortex, networks associated with long-term planning and creative problem solving can enter states of hyper-synchronization when a person is locked into a meaningful mission. In these states, the brain reproduces some of the same neurochemical patterns we see during romantic attachment. This overlap is not metaphorical, it is measurable, it is biological, and so, the public watches someone who behaves with fierce devotion to their work and assumes there must be someone they're doing this for. But neuroscience reveals a compelling twist. The brain itself can become that someone. The internalized mission, the long-term vision, the imagined future, the symbolic representation of what the person is trying to build. These can activate neural pathways identical to those activated by love. Passion for progress and passion for a partner share biological ancestry. Our brains evolved long before our modern definitions of ambition. They interpret devotion in a limited number of ways, and romantic language becomes the default placeholder. This is why the myth persists. It's not because people crave gossip. It's because people crave meaning. They crave explanation. They crave emotional equilibrium in the stories they create. And when a person demonstrates exceptional drive, the audience wants to locate the heart behind the motion, the soul behind the strategy, the emotional engine under the cognitive hood. The mystery love becomes the narrative container for that longing. It becomes the shape we give to an emotional truth we can sense but cannot see. And in that sense, the myth is not a lie. It is an interpretation. And here is where we enter even deeper waters. Because when we examine what sustains innovation at the neurological level, we find that emotional stability is not merely useful, it is essential. Humans do not create from chaos, they create through chaos, anchored by something that keeps the self intact. And whether that anchor is a person, a dream, a memory, a fear, or an imagined companion, the mechanism remains the same. The brain requires balance to handle brilliance. If brilliance becomes too heavy, the mind fractures. If balance becomes too thin, burnout consumes the creative spark. This delicate interplay determines whether a visionary thrives or collapses. And so, when society asks whether a visionary has a mystery love, they are unknowingly articulating a profound psychological truth. They are searching for the stabilizing force that allows such a mind to survive its own intensity. They are sensing the emotional necessity behind intellectual achievement. They are trying to understand what the human mind needs to endure the impossible. This question, fact or fiction, is less about identifying a person and more about understanding a pattern. A pattern woven through the brain's deep architecture, where identity, desire, ambition, and attachment collide. And when we study those intersections, we discover that every human who carries a monumental mission also carries an inner counterpart. Not necessarily a lover, not necessarily a confidant, but a psychological presence that travels with them through the corridors of their ambition. Neuroscience calls this phenomenon internalized attachment representation. It is the echo of someone, real or imagined, whose emotional imprint becomes a stabilizer long after the physical presence is gone or perhaps never existed at all. This internal companion can emerge from childhood memories, early mentors, personal fantasies, or fragments of relationships that were brief but transformative. And the human brain, always efficient and always driven by pattern, holds on to the imprint rather than the person. It uses that imprint as fuel, as comfort, as a navigational constellation in the darkest hours of effort. This internalized presence can become so vivid, so integrated into the cognitive architecture, that observers from the outside naturally imagine there must be a real figure behind it. But sometimes the mystery love is just the brain doing what it does best, creating a stabilizing narrative structure that allows a person to withstand extreme demands. Think of astronauts preparing for months in isolation. Many of them develop what we call compensatory emotional constructs, mental representations of support and companionship that help them maintain psychological integrity in environments where external reassurance is impossible. Not because they are delusional, but because they are human. The brain will always generate what the environment fails to provide. Even high-performing CEOs and innovators experience similar internal landscapes, though their environments look nothing like deep space. They orbit the outer edges of uncertainty, complexity, and responsibility. They live in decision, making oxygen levels much thinner than the average person's. Their failures echo louder, their risks cut deeper, their timelines move faster. This produces intense emotional strain that the mind must buffer. And so, the brain constructs an inner stabilizer. Sometimes it is the memory of someone they once loved. Sometimes it is the image of someone they wish they could become. Sometimes it is the emotional silhouette of a partner who never existed, but whose imagined presence helps reinterpret fear as courage and exhaustion as persistence. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and the brain does not wait for the world to give meaning. It generates its own. But the public does not see this. They see the outcome, the relentless drive, the boundless energy, the almost mythic ambition, and they search for the invisible cause. The more extraordinary the visible achievements, the more extraordinary they expect the hidden story to be. This is how the mystery love becomes a cultural phenomenon, a collective projection. It is the audience's attempt to locate humanity inside a life that seems defined by machinery, equations, and scale. The myth grows because people fear that too much brilliance makes a person untouchable, unreachable. They introduce an imagined emotional counterpart to pull the figure back into human territory. Yet there is another layer, a subtler and deeper one, that explains why the idea of a hidden love entices so many minds. Humans instinctively equate vulnerability with authenticity. When a public figure seems too composed, too powerful, too certain, people feel distance. But the suggestion of a hidden tenderness, a quiet emotional dependency, a private heart, this restores a sense of access. It makes the extraordinary relatable. It makes the unreachable touchable. It reassures people that even the titans of innovation carry soft, unguarded corners within them. What's fascinating is that the human brain is equally captivated by what it cannot see as by what it can. Mystery activates the same neural pathways as anticipation. Dopamine rises in response to the unknown, not because the unknown is pleasurable, but because it might become meaningful. And so, when people speculate about an unseen love, They are participating in a neurological dance, one that rewards curiosity with a hint of emotional excitement. The unknown partner becomes a symbol of possibility. This phenomenon isn't new. It echoes through history. Every visionary has had a mythic shadow, an imagined confidant the public invented for them. Even in ancient times, philosophers, emperors, and artists were said to have mysterious loves who inspired their craft or anchored their sanity. These myths rarely reflected reality, but they reflected public yearning. Humans want to believe that no one achieves the impossible alone. They want to believe that behind every monumental act stands an emotional sanctuary. But here is where the metaphor becomes powerful. Because in a psychological sense, no one does achieve the impossible alone, not even the most solitary figures. The companion, however, does not have to be a person. It may be a dream. It may be a future version of oneself. It may be the memory of a parent who whispered encouragement decades ago. It may be the imagined voice of someone who believes in them without judgment. The brain is never as alone as the body appears, and when society imagines a mystery love, they are sensing, without conscious knowledge, that emotional companionship is essential to the survival of audacious missions. They simply misinterpret the form. Now, let's step into the realm of creative neuroscience for a moment, because this is where research becomes poetic. We know that innovation requires the brain to hold contradictory states simultaneously. It must be grounded yet visionary, skeptical yet hopeful, disciplined yet imaginative. This duality is not physically comfortable. It strains neural circuits in ways that are difficult to articulate. And so, the brain creates emotional scaffolding. It builds an inner relationship that keeps the self coherent while handling contradictory pressures. In effect, the mind becomes its own partner. It becomes the mystery love. And when you understand this, the myth shifts from gossip to insight. The question is no longer, who is the hidden lover? But rather, what inner companion sustains the mind that dares to think at such scale? This reframing reveals a truth the world rarely acknowledges. Every visionary builds their dreams with both intellect and intimacy. Intimacy with an idea, a memory, a mission. The emotional bond may not be with a person, but it is real, it is protective, and it is necessary. This is why the myth persists as both fact and fiction. Fiction, because the public imagines a literal partner. Fact, because a psychological presence genuinely exists, just not in the form people expect. The mind cannot climb certain mountains alone. It climbs with an internal companion, one shaped by experience, hope, longing, and resilience. Now imagine the life of someone building at a global scale, someone whose daily work involves decisions that ripple across industries and generations. The weight of that responsibility demands an extraordinary internal architecture. It demands emotional regulation systems that can withstand failure, public scrutiny, impossible expectations, and relentless pace. It demands a mind that can recover from collapse faster than most people recover from minor disappointment. No amount of intelligence is enough. What sustains them is the emotional infrastructure beneath the intellect. And so, the mystery love becomes a metaphor for that infrastructure. It symbolizes the inner relationship that carries a person through storms others never see. It symbolizes the voice that says, "Try again," when the world says, "Give up." It symbolizes the emotional constellation that guides the mind when it enters darkness, so deep that rational thought alone cannot navigate it. Everyone has such a constellation, whether they recognize it or not. For some, it is a partner. For others, a purpose. For others, still a memory. And for a few, it is a dream so vast it feels alive. But the deeper truth, the one the public rarely understands, is that ambition at the highest levels is not powered by ego, intelligence, or even confidence. It is powered by emotional physics, the intricate dance between neural necessity and personal mythology. The mystery love simply becomes the symbol through which society glimpses that dance. And so, when people debate whether such a figure has a hidden love, they are unknowingly asking a profound question. What sustains a mind that refuses to break? This question leads us into the final, most revealing layer of all, the understanding that even the strongest minds carry an inner tenderness that shapes the trajectory of their greatest achievements. The world often confuses intensity with hardness, but intensity is usually born from sensitivity, not the absence of it. The individuals who build the boldest futures are often the ones who feel the most deeply. They may not show it. They may not speak about it. They may wrap their tenderness in layers of logic, steel, and resolve. But make no mistake, the engine of extraordinary ambition is rarely cold. It is warm. It is emotional. It is alive with longing. Longing is one of the most misunderstood forces in neuroscience. It is not simply desire. It is the mind reaching toward what it cannot yet hold. Longing is the emotional twin of vision. Where vision imagines the world as it could be, longing imagines the self as it could become. Together, they form the emotional backbone of bold thinking. And this is where the metaphor of the mystery love becomes not only understandable, but necessary. It represents the emotional source code of the visionary psyche, the longing that sustains the journey, the internal companion that holds the mind steady while it stretches into the unknown. When we study the brain under extreme pursuit, the pursuit of discovery, influence, innovation, we see neural signatures that mirror those found in deep attachment. Dopaminergic pathways fire in anticipation of progress. The temporal parietal junction lights up as the mind imagines the future self. The insula activates as uncertainty introduces emotional risk. The amygdala quiets as internal reassurance, real or imagined, convinces the brain to proceed. What the public interprets as confidence is often a delicate neurological ballot. And the imagined presence of support, even if it has no physical counterpart, becomes the choreography that holds the self together. This is why the myth of a hidden love follows visionaries like a shadow. People intuit that such emotional choreography must exist, even if they misidentify its form. They sense the invisible tenderness that supports visible strength. They perceive the quiet emotional gravity that holds the extraordinary from drifting into madness. They understand, on some instinctive human level, that no great mind survives its own intensity without some kind of internal sanctuary. The sanctuary is real. The mystery love is its story. And perhaps the most interesting truth is this: the mind performs better when it believes it is not alone. This is not poetic speculation. It is measurable. Studies on resilience, long-term goal pursuit, and cognitive endurance all point in the same direction. When the brain feels supported, even symbolically, it increases its tolerance for stress and uncertainty. It interprets obstacles as surmountable. It maintains clarity under pressure. It retains the capacity for creative synthesis. Whether that support comes from the memory of a mother's voice, the echo of a mentor's encouragement, or the imagined presence of a partner who stands beside the self in some internal landscape, the effect is real. Emotional belief becomes cognitive fuel. The metaphor becomes biology. And so, when people debate whether a visionary's mystery love is fact or fiction, the most accurate answer is that it is both, not in the literal sense, but in the neurological one. Fiction, because the public imagines an external partner that may not exist. Fact, because an emotional counterpart always exists internally, shaping the mind's endurance, courage, and sense of possibility. The mystery is not about who the person is, but who the inner companion has become. But let's step back from the science for a moment, because understanding the human experience requires more than analysis. It requires empathy. Imagine the life of someone who wakes each day to decisions that affect millions, who must constantly stand in the tension between what is and what could be. A person who must negotiate with uncertainty more often than most people negotiate with routine. There is loneliness in that. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of responsibility. The kind that grows in silent chambers of the mind where few can follow. And in that solitude, the internal companion becomes essential. It becomes the echo that responds when no one else can. It becomes the emotional hand on the shoulder when the world is too heavy. It becomes the voice that steadies the mind when doubts threaten to fracture it. And whether that internal companion resembles a past love, a hopeful future, a symbolic partner, or simply the dream itself, it fulfills the role the brain needs most to make the impossible feel survivable. This inner dialogue is not weakness, it is architecture. It is how the human brain maintains structural integrity under conditions that would shatter unprotected minds. And the public's fascination with the fictionalized version of this companion reflects their intuitive recognition of its importance. People imagine someone beside the visionary, not because they crave gossip, but because they understand, consciously or not, that the human heart was never designed to chase the extraordinary alone. But here lies the twist. Even the most isolated innovators are not truly alone. Their inner world is populated with emotional constructs, symbolic partners, and psychological anchors that keep them stable. The mystery love becomes the mythic shorthand for this hidden architecture, a myth born not from scandal, but from emotional logic, a myth that survives because it speaks to a truth the rational mind often refuses to acknowledge, that tenderness is not the opposite of strength, but its silent co-author. When we begin to see the story this way, everything changes. The question is no longer about identifying someone in the shadows. It becomes about recognizing the universal human pattern beneath the legend. We all carry a mystery love inside us, a memory, a dream, a source of comfort we turn to when the world becomes unsteady. For some, this mystery love is a person they cherish. For others, it is the whisper of an ambition that refuses to die. For others still, it is the imagined encouragement of someone they have yet to meet. But for everyone, it exists, and the more daunting the mission, the more vital this inner companion becomes. This is why I often tell my students and colleagues that the study of exceptional minds is not simply the study of intelligence. It is the study of emotional engineering. It is the study of how people build internal structures that allow them to endure storms without sinking. And no matter how impressive the outer accomplishments may be, rockets launched, industries disrupted, ideas spread, revolutions sparked, the inner architecture is always the quiet masterpiece. People rarely speak about this, perhaps because vulnerability feels like risk, perhaps because society prefers to celebrate strength in isolation. But the truth is more intricate. Strength emerges from connection. Sometimes that connection is external, visible and beautifully human. Sometimes it is internal, private, and invisible to the world. Sometimes it is a love remembered. Sometimes it is a love imagined, but it is always present. And if we reframe the myth through this lens, we begin to appreciate it not as a rumor, but as a reflection of our own hopes. The public longs to believe that visionaries feel deeply because we long to believe that we can feel deeply and still achieve greatly. The myth becomes a permission slip, a reminder that emotional complexity does not diminish brilliance, but enriches it. This leads us to the most powerful insight of all. The mystery love is not a character in someone else's story. It is an archetype in our own. It represents the emotional power we all carry, the quiet force that allows us to rebuild after loss, to persevere after failure, to imagine after disappointment. It represents the tenderness that survives even in the most turbulent minds. It represents our shared human truth that nobody moves through life powered by logic alone. And if there is one lesson we can take from this, one that transcends neuroscience, ambition, and myth, it is that we must honor the emotional realities that sustain us. We must acknowledge the presence of the inner companions who guide us, the symbolic loves who steady us, the unseen forces that make our boldest steps possible. Because the difference between collapse and breakthrough is often found in those quiet internal relationships the world will never see. So the next time we wonder whether a visionary carries a mystery love, perhaps the most honest answer is this: yes, but not in the way we think. The mystery is not in the identity of another person. It is in the profound emotional structures that lie hidden within the human mind. And those structures are not only real, they are essential. If we understood this more deeply, we would see brilliance not as an isolated phenomenon, but as a collaboration between intellect and emotion, mission and memory, dream and tenderness, we would see that greatness is never truly solitary. It is always accompanied by an inner presence, a quiet companion that whispers courage into uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, recognizing this would help us build our own futures with a little more compassion, a little more understanding, a little more appreciation for the unseen forces that hold us together when the world feels too heavy. It would remind us that the mystery love is not a rumor to decode, but a truth to honor, a truth that lives not in the shadows of someone else's life, but in the unlit corners of our own. And if we can embrace that truth, if we can recognize the emotional architectures that sustain us, then we can carry our ambitions with steadier hands and live our lives with a deeper sense of connection. Because the mystery love, whether fact or fiction, is ultimately a reflection of what makes us human. It is the reminder that tenderness and brilliance are not opposites but partners, that vision and vulnerability walk the same road, and that even the greatest minds, for all their power, are guided by the same quiet heartbeat the rest of us share. And perhaps that heartbeat, steady, unseen, and enduring, is the real love story after all.